Hello, and thank you for listening to my dissertation. The dissertation is titled Creating Multifunctional Landscapes in a Monocultural World, Out with the Perfectly Trimmed, In with Urban Agroecosystems. Just so you know, while I'm presenting, I've got my poster, which I've shared with you on the screen, to the desktop to my left, and you and my audience to the front, so that you kind of know where I'm looking and as I'm presenting with you. So during this presentation, we will work through the highlights first of the study, hitting on the main points, what the goals were, what an overview of the methodology, an overview of the primary phrases that we worked through. Then we'll go a little bit more into the methodology, diving into how we conducted the study and what exactly we did and who we did it with. We will work through the photos that you see in the upper right-hand corner of the poster and what they meant for the study. Then we'll finish with the results, what we gleaned, especially regarding the opportunities and constraints that we found from the interviews that we did, and then the conclusion thoughts. So let's get started. The highlights, starting in this part of the poster. Highlights. We were aiming to establish the basis to form a future proposal for a framework metric that would allow designers and developers to maximize the functionality of their landscapes. So the idea was that there are increasing population, decreasing land available for use. And we have by and large not really used a lot of the green spaces that we have in urban areas very well. A lot of them are practically functionless, or they have only a basic recreational function. So we are looking at how we could improve that, specifically by studying urban agriculture and urban biodiversity. These are the two primary points. So when we say the goal of using experts across three categories, things like that, these categories are informed. The research question, the two essential forms of functionality are urban biodiversity and urban agriculture. So our goal was, as I said, to use experts with 10 plus years of experience, at least a decade, real world experience, to get an idea, a foundation to use for this framework that wouldn't be based on theory, that would be based on actual life experience of people across the UK in 3 different sectors. These sectors included those working in urban agriculture, those working in urban biodiversity, and landscape architects working to design the green spaces with one or both of these functions. We'll go into that a little bit more during the methodology. So the goal was to get that basis formed. The framework is a similar idea to the way that Building with Nature has done their accreditation process and their framework, the way that the Urban Green Factor works in London, things like that, but with different standards regarding specifically the functionality of landscapes, not just their biodiversity points, such as you get with biodiversity net gain, but also how they are engaging the community, how they are educating, how the landscapes are being productive. So that brings us on to the primary phrases that in the introduction and throughout the paper were really pulled on during the study, in both the interviews and then the discussion and conclusion. So it's important to understand those 4 primary phrases because they really play into that a lot. Functionality was the first one. Functionality really means that it either produces something specific. So that would be regarding urban agriculture. It produces something that people can use, or it is being functional in terms of people's usage of it. It's being functional in terms of the biodiversity that it's giving back to nature, things like that. But it has to be functional in some kind of way. It has to be actively working, not a passive landscape. Productivity also ties into that a lot. So the two categories of productivity include actually producing something. So the way that you would literally take that word and producing a positive effect. So the way that it would give back to the environment, or it would give back to the local flora and fauna of the area. And then there's urban biodiversity, which urban and biodiversity are two important parts of that phrase, since we are specifically considering urban and peri-urban contexts. We are not looking into the rural application of biodiversity. The structure of it would be very different. Biodiversity itself is not just the flora, which is where it starts, but the impact that has on the different kinds of fauna that you get, both mammals, invertebrates, birds, anything like that, so that you're bringing in through the establishment of certain plant palettes and typologies. Then you have urban agriculture, which is growing a lot of times on a much smaller scale in an urban setting. So when we talk about our urban agriculture, we are not talking about large, comprehensive monocultural fields. Essentially the opposite, edible landscapes or forager-friendly landscapes, things like that. So moving into the methodology, we started by defining the research question, which we've got laid out above. How can we make urban green spaces more functional by integrating two essential forms of functionality within an urban setting? Those forms of functionality, urban biodiversity and urban agriculture. And then we continued that by laying out the definitions that we just talked about, and to be able to supply both the interviewees and those reading the dissertation in the future with an overall comprehension and understanding of exactly what we were trying to communicate during the interview process. We went on with a pilot study of the questions so that we could get an idea of whether or not they were effective. So we did this with Dr. Matthew Reed, and he gave really good feedback on maybe how to steer it. Some of that feedback we were able to apply, and some of it was very interesting, more culturally based. And for this part of the study, that just made it too broad. And so we decided to throw that out, but to consider it for future research is thinking about the cultural aspects and give and take, especially when you have it in the same country. And so those mini cultural moments. And yeah, so we were able to take from that and develop the questions a little bit further. The questions themselves were three categories of questions, and I left them very open-ended so that it directed people's thoughts without giving them specific answers that they needed to provide us with. We wanted them to be able to have the freedom to think about any of the examples, any types of planting palettes or ways that they were able to apply it in their own unique way. And so this allowed for a flowing conversation and for people to really dive deeper into it, because they were just able to kind of pull anything instead of specifically answering yes or no questions. Were not part of the interview process. This allowed us to analyze the interviews and to find keywords and phrases out of these, long monologues that some of them gave us, that a lot of them gave us, so that we could pull the primary ideas for and identify some of the successes and the reasons for failures in their projects and designs. And both of these, success or failure, were mutually informative, we found. Then upon examination, we also pulled out the ways that they specifically used urban agriculture and urban biodiversity. And one of the most important, we identified their constraints and opportunities so that we could then use those to continue to form the basis of this framework. So the images that you see in the upper right-hand corner, those exemplify a type of edible landscape without it being entirely edible. Then you have a rooftop garden, which is extremely popular in an urban setting, both for biodiversity and agriculture. And then you see a suds planting in a dense urban area. And so these were often used either during the interviews at some point to clarify exactly what we were talking about or what context we were trying to pull from. In the end, the results we got focused on the opportunities and the constraints pulled from the key words, phrases, and ideas from each one of the interviews. We did 10 interviews with across the 3 categories so that we could get this results and start to form the basis for the future framework. So the opportunities that we identified was the evidence of a cyclical nature of when you increase the biodiversity in one place, such as the flora, the biodiversity of the flora, it directly impacts the increase in the biodiversity of the fauna and the invertebrates. Another impact that we saw that really increased biodiversity was the relation between composting and a totally different kind of category of invertebrates specifically, but also mammalian diversity that you saw throughout the site. Then there was the potential in some areas for a really significant community-based impact and a sense of togetherness that it created in the community. But we also saw, as we'll talk about in the constraints as well, that coming up with a community-led initiative and plan at the beginning of the project was really important for it actually having that impact. Otherwise, one of the constraints that we saw, a big one, was the struggle to get community engagement when you haven't planned for it and you haven't laid out your project in a way that encourages people to engage with you. And that was very frustrating for some people, specifically working in urban agriculture. Going back to the opportunities, the encouragement as well, that both, if you have a focus on urban agriculture, if you have a focus on urban biodiversity, it deeply encouraged the increasing positive landscape design trends, such as forager-friendly landscape design trends, that is edibly focused for either humans or wildlife, and that's very positive. And then there's lots of other design trends that were pulled out during the dissertation that got more of a focus when the ethos of a project was centered around urban agriculture and biodiversity. Then finally, it was the capacity for the educational aspect, both for the public and the engagement of youth, which means that we're encouraging a whole new generation of people to re-engage and understand how they can use fruits and vegetables in their daily lives, and even what it's like to harvest blackberries in an urban environment or something like that. That was the basis of childhood a long time ago, but has fallen out in these urban areas. A lot of the constraints focused on the inaccessibility or the lack of community knowledge and engagement. So getting water to inaccessible areas was one of the biggest one. The lack of general knowledge from volunteers was another really large one. Horticulturally, littering in some of the areas, this had a particular cultural and socioeconomic bent. So some areas in some agricultural or biodiverse landscapes, if they were in a wealthier area, didn't tend to have this problem at all, hadn't even considered it. And then if they were in a poorer landscape where the poverty rate was higher, littering was a huge, even fly tipping in these areas was a huge problem. The commercialization of agriculture in dense urban settings is also an issue. So it no longer becomes a community-focused, a community-driven plan. It becomes a commercialized process, which then almost excludes the public and just becomes private sector anyway. So does it really have a lot of impact? A lack of understanding between landscape architects and engineers is also another big one. So when you're trying to put in more of these biodiverse areas and the engineers say no, especially when it comes to suds. So more language and understanding needs to be developed there, and maintenance will always be a huge issue. So you might design the most friendly, forager friendly, biodiverse, just this amazing landscape. And if you don't have the maintenance plan for it, then it's not going to get you very far. So in conclusion, we found that our research gaps going forward is to build an understanding of the public perspectives of this. So this was specifically focusing on the experts and their real world experience and their application, but it'd be interesting to get more of a public perspective of how we could build this in, or how they would like to engage with these two types of landscapes, and how they would like to engage with them when they're merged into one to maximize that functionality. There was only a possibility for limited interviews. So because of the decreased amount of time to be able to do this, so instead of having the full 7.5-month period where we could have gotten a lot more interviews done and a large basis to actually form the final basis of the framework and then be able to move on towards the framework, we only had a 2.5-month period. So we're able to start the basis, but not to finalize it. And then the examination and study of the current available metrics and where we would want to improve on them, and things we'd like to take, and then things we'd like to leave out because it doesn't really encourage what we're trying to focus on. So we were able to start to establish a sliding scale of functionality. So starting with the ethos of mainly urban agriculture or mainly urban biodiversity, and how you could the basis is how you could institute these things depending on the kind of landscape you want, but to always along any point of the scale be maximizing the functionality of the land. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to the dissertation. I hope that you found it informative and that you enjoy the presentation. Thank you so much. Bye.